The case of Cindy James. This case has some disturbing elements, and as a result, viewer discretion is advised. Maybe the only thing worse than being stalked and terrified is not being believed, being so isolated when all you want is help. In 1982, Cindy James was a nurse. She lived in Richmond, which is a suburb of Vancouver, British Columbia. She'd been born into a stable home in 1944 with an Air Force colonel father and a stay-at-home mom with 5 other siblings. It was a loving home, and she would go on to marry a physician who was 20 years her senior. This happened while she was enrolled in nursing school herself. Her life seemed pretty golden. She would eventually go on to work at a treatment center for kids who were struggling with behavioral issues. It was exactly where she wanted to be, helping children thrive, but in private, Cindy was struggling. Cindy would go on to split from her husband, and she seemed to be pretty happy for a time. She especially liked working with children. Her husband was an area psychiatrist who was quite wealthy. Her dream life became a nightmare, and it took only 3 months after the split with her husband for it to start happening. Someone began throwing rocks through her window. They would pelt her porch lights with rocks until they broke. Then someone actually broke into the house. Messages would appear in her home that had been written in cut-out letters from magazines, saying things like, "Soon, Cindy," and "I see you." She called the police after each incident, like we are always told to do, trusting the police to keep her safe. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police did take her seriously at first. She even began a relationship with Officer Pat McBride, who was so afraid for her that he temporarily moved in to keep her safe. The calls began coming in at all times of day and night, and Cindy was unable to ever recognize the voice, as it was always disguised. And of course, back then there wasn't caller ID. Officer McBride even caught the ex-husband of Cindy James crouched in the alley holding 2 guns at one point. Her ex-husband didn't confess, though, far from it. Instead, he claimed he was patrolling the area to keep Cindy safe. He claimed he was worried about her, and he was just trying to protect her. More and more notes began appearing outside of the home, all threatening, and one more disturbing than the next. In January of 1983, her friend Agnes stopped by. When Agnes arrived, Cindy was in the garage with a black nylon tied around her neck. Cindy had gone out into the garage, saying someone jumped her from behind. Cindy was covered with wounds, and the police would note they were done with a sharp object. Cindy said she was convinced she only made it through that attack because Agnes scared the person off. The police would then arrive, and she told them that someone had been knocking at the back door, and when she opened it, she found a man standing there, and that he immediately began attacking her. The police chose to give her a polygraph test, and then another. She failed both. She would later admit that she knew her attacker. She would say that he threatened her family, and she was too terrified to disclose his name. She fully believed he would harm someone she loved if she turned him in, saying he forced her into the garage and continued attacking. The police noted she lived a pretty normal life. She wasn't into drugs, and she wasn't into anything illegal. If someone was after her, it was for a personal reason, likely someone who was not stable. And there's no indication, other than finding her ex-husband outside on one occasion, that he was considered a suspect. In fact, no particular suspect was ever named. Even after the physical attack, the psychological harassment escalated. She would hear prowlers outside, pretty sure that it was more than one person. And each time, her porch light would be smashed and broken. So every time she was unable to see who was out there, she would be huddled inside, afraid they were going to come in. On one occasion, she found 3 dead cats hanging in her garden. On another occasion, a photo of a deceased person, taken inside of a morgue, was on her car. Yet another time, the police were called because the phone line was cut. It went on like this for nearly 6 years. Someone choked her dog with a cord around his neck, though he was thankfully found in time and recovered, although they noted the dog appeared traumatized. She confided to her friend Agnes at one point that whoever was tormenting her told her he doesn't want to kill her, but he rather wants to scare her to death. The police, for their part, were convinced she was making it up. No fingerprints were ever discovered, and then, of course, there were the failed lie detector tests. Although, of course, there's also a reason those tests are not allowed to be considered in court. All they do is they test the physiological responses in the person taking it. And it's noted that if somebody is nervous or full of anxiety, it could affect the test. Although, whether it's right or not, those tests often make or break the opinion of law enforcement. The police did order 24-hour surveillance for 1 week, with 14 officers hidden throughout the area. But nothing ever happened during that week, which did play a part in why the police believed that she was doing it herself. It was then she hired her own private investigator. It was a man named Ozzy Caban, and he was open that he believed that Cindy wasn't giving the full story, because her attacker had threatened her and her family. But he believed there really was somebody attacking her. The private investigator stayed in contact with Cindy one evening, using a two-way radio, which did catch one incident in progress. It started with odd noises in the radio, which caused the man to rush over to Cindy's house. When he arrived, he circled the home, trying to get in, but it was locked. He was able to look in a window and observe her lying on the floor. He believed, in fact, that she was dead. There was a note physically pinned into her hand with a paring knife. Horrified, the investigator called 911, and she briefly came to long enough to tell the police that a man came in through the gate and hit her. The last thing she remembered was somebody holding her down and putting a needle in her arm. On this occasion, the police didn't even bother to look for fingerprints, and in fact, they didn't work the scene at all. They simply announced she had staged it herself. There were other attacks after this. Once she was found in a ditch 6 miles from home with a stocking tied around her neck, wearing men's work boots and gloves. The police again refused to investigate at all, even though she was covered with bruises and scratches. Others pointed out that if she was staging it herself, she'd do a better job. Instead, everything was done in a way to further isolate and terrorize her. Her friend Agnes stood by her, along with the husband of Agnes named Tom, and they both fully believed that someone was doing all of this to Cindy. They would sometimes stay at her home so that she wouldn't be alone, and even then, with people there, things would happen. Tom and Agnes were there once when there were strange noises downstairs. When Tom investigated, he found the basement of the home on fire. Tom would call 911, but the phone line had been cut again. Tom ran outside and found a man standing on the curb who ran away when Tom yelled to call 911, and the man called no one. It's unknown if that was the perpetrator. The police again insisted it was staged. A reporter claimed there was no dust or fingerprints outside the windowsill, meaning someone inside had set the fire. The same reporter claimed that Wendy was seen walking her dog at 3 a.m., and that this proved she wasn't really scared for her safety. Although if she was walking her dog at 3 a.m., I would suspect that her friends that were staying in the house would have known. It was at this moment that Cindy had enough and would finally name the person who'd been attacking and tormenting her, and she said the person who had threatened her to not say his name was Dr. Roy Makepeace, her ex-husband. The problem being Dr. Roy Makepeace had a really good, solid reputation in the community. He was also a psychiatrist who might know how to terrorize somebody. The police did question him, at least at one point, and he told the police he'd been getting death threats himself. He also claimed that his wife had multiple personality disorder, and she suffered from extreme delusions. It's important to note he is the only one who's ever made any claims against her mental health, or at least the only person on record. That is, until Cindy James was admitted to a psychiatric facility after all of this had happened, and she had identified her ex-husband. She would spend 10 weeks there, and 2 different psychiatrists did determine that she had been staging her own attacks while suffering a psychotic break. Although, of course, there's no explanation why they would know for sure. It was during this hospital stint that she threatened to kill herself. She couldn't take it anymore. Whether this is because she was truly ill or because nobody believed her is a matter of opinion. Once she was hospitalized, she was fired from her job. For nearly a year, there would be no more attacks. Then they began again. Shortly after this, Cindy would go to the mall to cash a check and seemingly disappear. The police would find her car abandoned in the mall's parking lot, and there was blood on the driver's side, and the contents of her wallet were scattered about. But Cindy wasn't there. In the trunk, there were some groceries that were spoiling, and a gift she had purchased for her friend's son. This seems to indicate she didn't plan on going anywhere. and that she planned on using the food she purchased. So then where was Cindy? 2 weeks later, Cindy was found in the front of an abandoned house. She was naked from the waist down. Her hands were hog-tied behind her with her feet. She had a black nylon stocking tied around her neck, and her body was completely covered with bruises. In addition, she'd been given a lethal dose of morphine. The autopsy showed she died from a combination of morphine and asphyxiation from the stalking. Even more puzzling, the needle with the morphine was completely missing. Despite this, the police ruled it a suicide, at least according to some sources. Others state it was classified as a crime of an unknown event. According to her private investigator, there was no question she was murdered. He would say that the police were only interested in concluding it was a suicide. Although it does appear that the policeman she dated, as well as her ex-husband, was at least at one point considered a possible suspect. It's very weird. A lot of different statements conflict with one another. And honestly, I don't see how she could have taken her own life. And why would she buy food and put it in her trunk? Let me know what you think. It's incredibly short-sighted and cruel to me to suggest that despite the evidence to the contrary, she took her own life. I don't even see how that conclusion could be reached. Her hands were behind her back. The morphine was missing, which would also mean that it was taking effect as it had been injected. So where would she have hidden the syringe? And how did she hogtie herself? By this point, it was pretty well documented how angry the police were with her, saying that they had wasted over $1 million on her investigations up until that point. It was then that they chose to stop investigating. It was also noted the damage to her face was severe. It was described as being blackened and literally punched in. Could she have done all this damage to herself? The man who found her refused to believe it was even remotely possible for someone to have done that to themselves. And because everybody spoke out on record, I suspect the police must have said it was suicide, at least at some point. Cindy was 44 when she passed away in 1989. Dr. Roy Makepeace passed away in 2013 at the age of 87. The case of Jeanette Charlie Atwater from Billings, Montana. Charlie was born in 1966 and graduated from high school in Glendive, Montana, later attending Eastern Montana College, which is now Montana State University Billings, and she attended on a volleyball scholarship. But it was short-lived. Charlie hurt her knee and dropped out as a result. She was then living in Bellingham, Washington, when she met Robert Aiken and married him in 1990. They would eventually go on to have 3 kids. They divorced in 1995, and this led to Charlie coming back to Billings to start all over again and make a new life. She had only been working at Napa Auto Parts for a short time. They say she'd been dating around a little bit, but she hadn't found anyone special, and she couldn't see herself committing to anyone. In November of 1999, Charlie made a major sacrifice to save the uncle she loved, donating one of her kidneys to him at a hospital in Seattle. In January of 2000, 34-year-old Charlie Atwater was a well-liked divorced mother of 3. Her 3 kids were visiting their father, so Charlie was alone, socializing with some of her co-workers. She worked at the Napa Auto Parts store, and they had all gone to a local bar named the Players Club, located in an area of Billings, Montana, known as the Heights, which could be considered a suburb of the town. She'd driven her 1987 Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra to the bar that night, parking in the lot and going into the bar alone. Everyone reported that she'd had a good time that night, hanging out with her coworkers, and she'd been seen dancing with one man quite a few times during the night, but witnesses saw him leave. So, around 2 a.m., she was having a good time when closing time was called. Everyone left the bar, including her friends. They were filtering out into the lot, but nobody remembers seeing Charlie leave at this point. In fact, no one saw her leave at all, and they don't remember her being in the parking lot. 90 minutes later, at 3:32 a.m., there was a report of a burning car. It was a 1987 Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra. It was found in a small gravel parking lot off Bench Boulevard, which was not very far from where she was last seen. Around the time the fire was set, a man walked into the Senex convenience store, which was right next to the location of the fire. He was caught on surveillance camera purchasing $1 worth of gasoline. The man was 5'8", wearing a dark coat and dark pants. He was driving an older model compact car that was likely brown, and they believe it had an orange stripe on the side. The clerk would state that shortly after 3 a.m., the brown car pulled into the outermost pump at the station. The video camera marked the time at 3:09 a.m. The man went inside, paid for the gas, and grabbed matches. The matches for customers at the store were similar to the ones found by Charlie's car. The clerk had a hard time providing a good description of the car beyond a small brown hatchback with an orange stripe. She doesn't know if the man put the gas into the car or a container. She also couldn't remember if the man was alone. Once the fire was extinguished, they popped the trunk, and then they were stunned. Inside was Charlie. Her clothing and jewelry identified her, and this was backed up by dental records. Found at the scene was an empty gas can and some matches. It was completely mind-boggling as to how it had come to this. Charlie lived what would be called a low-risk lifestyle. She didn't gamble, she didn't do drugs, she wasn't in financial trouble, and she lived a pretty normal life. She was also a great mom and was well-liked by everybody around her. The question is, what happened in the 90 minutes between the bar closing and when her car was found, along with who and why? The Players Club had some cameras, but it didn't catch her leaving, so it's possible she exited out of the back before the call for closing time. The best clue is the man who purchased the gas, driving the brown hatchback. They believe he was around 5'10" and in his 30s, although one description does say 5'8". If he was in his 30s then, he would be in his 50s now. The clerk also remembered him wearing very strong aftershave. The police are holding back almost everything, including toxicology, with her blood level from that night, as well as holding back whether or not there might be any motives they know of. They also haven't reported whether or not she'd been assaulted before being put in the trunk, or if they even know. They believe the cause of death was smoke inhalation, meaning she was alive when placed in the trunk. They did reveal there was no indication she was wounded, nor was she bound. Now, of course, we have latch releases in the trunks, but we didn't back then. Her family hasn't forgotten, and they are clear that even knowing who and why isn't closure, because nothing can replace Charlie. Her stepmother, her uncle, her father, and her 3 kids all suffer to this day. If anyone has any idea what happened, please call the number on the screen. The case of Charlie Atwater has gone unsolved for 22 years. Thank you everybody for watching and listening. If you could help to get the channel noticed by the YouTube algorithm by liking and leaving a comment, even if you can just leave a thumbs up or some emoji, it counts as engagement. It would be so appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet. Thanks everyone. Take care of yourselves and each other. Thank you everybody for watching and listening. If you could help to get the channel noticed by the YouTube algorithm by liking and leaving a comment, even if you can just leave a thumbs up or some emoji, it counts as engagement. It would be so appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet. Thanks everyone. Take care of yourselves and each other.